If you break your arm, an X-ray shows this really clean, jagged white line.
Right. It's completely visible.
Exactly. The doctor just points at the screen and says, there's the fracture. It's totally binary. But when you experience severe trauma, the injury, well, it hides.
Yeah, it hides in fragmented memories, altered hormone loops, and honestly, shifting diagnostic manuals.
Which is wild. The injury is invisible, but the fallout is just devastatingly real. So today, we're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. For you, the curious learner who really wants to cut through the noise, we're exploring when trauma lingers.
Right.
Specifically, we're diving deep into post-traumatic stress disorder. And our stack of sources for this one is massive.
Oh, it really is.
Yeah, we've got excerpts from the major medical manuals like the DSM and the ICD, plus historical clinical accounts spanning over a century, and modern neurobiology research that is literally rewriting how we understand human survival.
And to truly grasp what this condition is, you really have to look at it as a collision, right? A collision of biology, history, and social policy.
It's not just a medical fact.
No, not at all. The diagnosis of PTSD is not a fixed fact of nature like that broken femur you mentioned. It's a constantly moving target. The clinical definition kind of acts as a mirror, reflecting society's willingness to acknowledge trauma at any given moment in history.
And PTSD is a term thrown around so loosely in pop culture today, right? Like, oh, that meeting gave me PTSD. But the actual science is just full of these counterintuitive surprises. So, okay, let's unpack this. Before we look at what happens in the brain, we have to understand what PTSD actually is today, because that definition has radically shifted.
Completely. We see that mirror really clearly in how the diagnostic manuals categorize it right now.
Yeah, so looking at the current manual used by psychiatrists in the US, the DSM-5-TR, it outlines 4 specific symptom clusters required for a diagnosis.
Right, and they have to last for more than 1 month.
Yes, crucial point. So you have intrusion, which is the unwanted memories and flashbacks. Then avoidance, basically steering clear of triggers. Then there's negative alterations in cognition and mood. And finally, alterations in arousal and reactivity, which covers, the hypervigilance and those exaggerated startle responses.
And the clinical reality here is that those 4 clusters, they don't just sit side by side. They actively feed into one another.
Like a loop.
Exactly. It's this vicious cycle. So the intrusion symptoms like a sudden nightmare or a sensory flashback, they're so distressing that they force the avoidance behavior.
Oh, I see. So a person might just stop driving or stop socializing completely.
Or turn to substances to just numb those intrusions. And then that avoidance isolates them, which deepens the negative mood alterations like that pervasive sense of detachment.
Or just this distorted belief that the entire world is constantly dangerous.
Precisely. And because the brain is constantly scanning for that danger, it remains locked in that 4th cluster, high arousal. The whole system just exhausts itself.
It's almost like a software update for a medical diagnosis that completely changes the interface.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Like the hardware is the same, the person suffering is the same, but the way we group the symptoms dictates the entire treatment. I mean, in 1980, the DSM-3 only had 2 symptom clusters.
And by 2013, the DSM-5 moved it entirely out of the anxiety disorders category.
Which is huge. And depending on where you live, the definition changes entirely. Like the World Health Organization's manual, the ICD-11, they went the total opposite direction of the American DSM.
They really did. They stripped the baseline diagnosis down to just 3 core symptoms to make it strictly about the fear response.
But then, and this is fascinating, they created a totally separate diagnosis called complex PTSD, right?
Yes, CPTSD. That's for people who have endured repeated, inescapable trauma.
Like long-term domestic abuse or childhood neglect.
Exactly, because that prolonged exposure fundamentally alters a person's core self-organization in ways that, say, a single car crash might not.
So the fact that these massive international manuals can't even agree on a single framework, I mean, it really forces us to look at the history of how this condition even entered the medical lexicon.
Well, the history is wild.
Oh.
You can trace the early clinical observations all the way back to 1889.
With the French neurologists, right? Jean-Martin Charcot and Pierre Janet.
Right. They described it as traumatic hysteria. They were really among the first to notice that overwhelming events could cause memories to essentially split off from ordinary consciousness.
And then decades later, during the American Civil War, you have physicians documenting soldiers' heart.
Right, which was characterized by profound exhaustion and racing heart rates, but with absolutely zero physical cardiac disease.
Fast forward to World War I, and the term changes again. Then it became shell shock.
And the initial medical consensus on shell shock was purely structural. Military doctors genuinely believed artillery blasts were causing this concussive microcellular damage to the actual nervous system.
Well, like invisible brain bleeding or something.
Yeah, exactly. The physical injury theory was really the only way the military establishment could rationalize the sheer volume of psychiatric casualties.
But that theory completely collapsed, didn't it?
It had to, because soldiers who had been nowhere near an artillery blast, men working in logistics or deep behind the lines, they started exhibiting the exact same paralandas, mutism, and terror.
Wow. So it wasn't the shock waves from the shells at all.
No. British psychiatrists, notably W.H.R. Rivers, who treated officers in Scotland, they actually had to fight the military brass to prove the damage was psychological.
That must have been quite the battle.
It was. But the breakthrough was recognizing the mind's capacity to literally shatter under prolonged terror, completely independent of a physical blow to the head.
Yet the true watershed moment, like the official inclusion of PTSD in the DSM-3 in 1980, that wasn't just a quiet victory of laboratory science.
Not at all. It was a massive socio-political battle.
Yeah, because Vietnam War veterans were returning to a psychiatric establishment that often viewed their breakdowns as pre-existing character flaws.
Right. If a soldier couldn't cope, the military framing was often, well, they're just inherently weak, or they have a latent personality disorder.
Blaming the victim, basically.
Exactly. And the resistance to codifying this trauma was intense. To actually change the manual, it required clinical advocates.
Psychiatrists like James Shatan and Robert J. Lifton, right?
Yes, and they organized these RAP groups, which were essentially early peer support and group therapy sessions for returning veterans.
Just bypassing the traditional pathologizing medical model entirely.
Exactly. Lifton, Shatan, and the veterans themselves presented undeniable data to the DSM task force.
And the key insight there, the single most important conceptual shift in all this history, is that they proved this profound distress was not a defect of character.
Right. It was a normal, predictable human response to a genuinely horrific environment.
So if the 1980s gave us the language to reframe this as a normal reaction to an abnormal event, it really took modern neuroscience to finally show us exactly how that reaction gets physically stuck in the brain.
It did. And we have to start from first principles here. The normal fear response is highly adaptive.
Right. Like running from a saber-toothed tiger.
Exactly. The amygdala detects a threat, triggers fight or flight, and your body floods with adrenaline so you can survive.
But once the tiger is gone, the alarm is supposed to shut off.
Right. In a normal response, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus eventually close the file, so to speak, and the alarm stands down. But the dysfunction in a traumatized brain happens well after the threat is gone.
Right. And when you look at fMRI scans of a brain grappling with PTSD, what exactly are we seeing?
We see a massive failure of inhibition. In a resilient brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical executive center, it assesses the aftermath of a threat and sends an inhibitory signal down to the amygdala.
Basically saying, hey, we're safe now, chill out.
Yes. But the neuroimaging in PTSD shows an underactive prefrontal cortex that's completely failing to apply those brakes, coupled with an amygdala that is hyperreactive.
It's like having a motion sensor security light on your house, but the calibration is completely broken.
That's a perfect analogy.
Like instead of turning on when a burglar approaches the driveway, the floodlights are just blinding you every single time a leaf blows across the lawn.
And that calibration failure is compounded by the third major neurobiological finding, which is a physical reduction in the volume of the hippocampus.
Which is the brain's timekeeper.
Exactly. It takes the raw, chaotic sensory data of an experience and weaves it into a coherent narrative. A beginning, a middle, and an end.
It basically stamps the memory with a time and a place.
Yes, it files it in the past.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, though, because I have to push back on the timeline of these brain changes based on the sources.
Oh, go for it.
So Rachel Yehuda's 2002 twin studies of Vietnam veterans, she looked at identical twins where one twin went to combat and developed PTSD, and the other twin stayed home in a safe environment.
Right, highly controlled.
But the neuroimaging showed the non-combat twin also had a smaller hippocampus.
Yes, they did.
Wait, so if the twin who never experienced the trauma has the exact same brain difference, doesn't that mean the smaller hippocampus is actually a pre-existing vulnerability, not just damage from the trauma itself?
It absolutely does. The twin studies really force us to discard that simple narrative of trauma causing localized brain damage.
Wow, so they were born with it.
Well, the data suggests that a smaller hippocampus acts as a pre-existing biological vulnerability. It doesn't mean someone is automatically destined to develop PTSD.
Right, you still need the triggering event.
Exactly. But it means their neurological machinery for contextualizing memories is naturally just a bit less robust. So when a massive trauma hits that vulnerable system, the hippocampus gets completely overwhelmed by this surge of stress hormones.
It just fails to timestamp the memory.
It does, and that explains the actual mechanics of a flashback.
Because the memory isn't filed as a narrative.
Right. It was never filed away in the past tense, so it exists in the brain as free-floating, fragmented sensory data.
Meaning it's encoded photographically, like the visual of a bright flash, or the specific smell of diesel fuel.
Or the sharp sound of a slamming door. Because the hippocampus failed to bind these fragments into a past tense story, the brain encounters that smell or sound years later and processes it as a current active threat.
So the amygdala fires as if the event is happening right now.
Exactly. A flashback does not feel like remembering a terrible Tuesday from 5 years ago. It feels like neurologically reliving the trauma in the present tense.
Which is just terrifying. But that brings up a massive statistical gap in the research, I think.
Oh, the prevalence rates.
Yeah. If these biological alarm systems exist in everyone, and well over half the population experiences a qualifying trauma at some point, you'd expect the rates of this disorder to be just enormous.
You would. But Kessler's National Comorbidity Survey shows the lifetime prevalence of PTSD in the U.S. is only about 6 to 9%.
Which is wild. Why doesn't everyone who goes through something terrible end up with this condition?
Well, for a very long time, the clinical assumption was that human beings were highly fragile. Therapists operated on this belief that anyone exposed to severe trauma would inevitably suffer long-term damage.
Right. That they need years of therapy.
But psychologist George Bonanno's research completely dismantled that assumption. He analyzed data from survivors of 9/11, massive natural disasters, severe bereavements.
And what did he find?
He demonstrated that the most common trajectory following a disaster is actually a transient period of distress, followed by a return to healthy functioning. Resilience is the statistical norm.
So most people just recover without formal treatment.
Yes. Most human nervous systems process the trauma and recalibrate naturally.
Yet, looking at the sources, there are specific populations where that natural resilience is heavily compromised. The risk factors shift wildly depending on the context.
Oh, drastically.
Like the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study in the 80s, they estimated a 15% current and 30% lifetime prevalence for those veterans.
Though it should be noted, researchers like Bruce Dornwend later debated those exact percentages by adjusting for verified combat exposure.
Right, but the rates remained exceptionally high regardless. And then you look at 9/11 first responders.
Right, studies found prevalence rates of 10 to 20% there, which really prove this isn't just a military combat disorder.
But then the data on interpersonal violence forces an even sharper pivot.
It does. When you analyze survivors of rape and sexual assault, the prevalence frequently spikes to between 30 and 50%.
That is a massive jump. Why such a huge difference compared to a natural disaster?
Because a hurricane or an earthquake, while terrifying, lacks intent. It's an act of nature. But interpersonal trauma involves the deliberate violation of bodily autonomy and trust by another human being.
The intent changes the biology.
Exactly. The nervous system processes intentional malice and betrayal far more severely than random environmental danger. The biological alarm system is vastly more likely to get stuck when the threat comes from within our own social fabric.
That nuance clears up a lot of misconceptions. Like, it really explains why the DSM-5 explicitly moved PTSD out of the anxiety disorders category.
Right. It's not just severe anxiety. It's a fundamental reorganization of the nervous system.
It also clears up the delayed onset specifier. Recognizing that an individual might function perfectly well for years, only to have the symptoms explode later when a completely unrelated life stressor degrades their coping mechanisms.
Yes, that's incredibly common. And crucially, the DSM-5 also dropped the long-standing requirement that the individual must experience acute fear or helplessness during the event itself.
Because early on, they assumed you had to feel terrified in the moment to get PTSD.
Right, that panic was the prerequisite for the injury. But neurobiology shows us that dissociation, emotional numbing, and tonic immobility, basically freezing.
Playing dead, almost.
Exactly. Those are deeply ingrained evolutionary survival responses. If fighting or fleeing is impossible, the brain literally shuts down the conscious processing of pain and terror to survive the moment.
So freezing doesn't protect the brain from the long-term fallout.
Not at all. The absence of outward panic during an assault does not mean the brain isn't being traumatized.
Man. And because the line between acute trauma, natural resilience, and a chronic clinical disorder is so heavily influenced by context, it's no wonder this is a magnet for intense scientific debates.
Oh, there's always a debate on the fringe of this field. The concept of moral injury is a perfect example where the neurobiological fear model kind of hits a wall.
Right, Jonathan Shea's work.
Yes, Shea was a psychiatrist who worked extensively with Vietnam veterans. And in his book, Achilles in Vietnam, he argued that the fear circuitry model fails to capture a very profound subset of psychological wounds.
He defined moral injury as the devastation that occurs when there's a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation.
Exactly.
Like witnessing a commanding officer order an attack on civilians or, I don't know, failing to save a friend because of a stupid logistical error.
Right. It doesn't necessarily trigger the immediate fight-or-flight amygdala response we talked about.
Yeah.
But it shatters the person's fundamental moral framework.
And the debate now is whether that requires an entirely separate diagnostic category, right?
Yes, because you can't really treat a ruptured moral compass with the same exposure therapies you'd use to desensitize a hyperactive amygdala. It's a completely different kind of wound.
And speaking of controversies in therapy, I mean, the 1990s false memory scandal with Elizabeth Loftus was massive. But even today, therapies with huge empirical backing are debated, like EMDR.
Ah, yes. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, developed by Francine Shapiro.
The World Health Organization endorses it. Millions of people have gotten better by basically following a therapist's fingers back and forth while recalling a fragmented memory.
It's highly effective.
But it's like a medication where we know the patient gets better, but we have absolutely no idea why the active ingredient works. The eye movements might not even be the important part.
Well, it is treated a bit like a mystery mechanism in the literature. The prevailing theory regarding EMDR right now involves taxing the working memory.
Okay, how does that work?
So when the brain is forced to focus on the bilateral stimulation of the eye movements, while simultaneously holding the traumatic memory in mind, the working memory reaches capacity.
It just gets overloaded.
Exactly. It cannot maintain the intense emotional charge of the flashback. So the memory degrades, becomes less vivid, and the hippocampus is finally able to reconsolidate it as a past tense event.
Wow.
But, as you noted, other researchers argue the eye movements are totally irrelevant, and it's simply a highly structured form of exposure therapy.
Which brings us to the counterintuitive biological findings, because there are some real paradoxes here.
Huge paradoxes.
If PTSD is the result of an alarm system that won't turn off, you would assume the body is just constantly drowning in stress hormones.
It was a logical assumption for a long time. More stress equals more stress hormone.
Right. But Rachel Yehuda's endocrinology research found the exact opposite.
She did. Individuals with PTSD frequently present with significantly lower baseline levels of cortisol than traumatized individuals who recovered naturally.
Which makes no sense at first glance.
It doesn't. But to understand that paradox, you have to look mechanistically at the HPA axis.
The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis?
Exactly. The body's internal hormone relay system. When a threat appears, the hypothalamus signals the pituitary, which signals the adrenal glands to release cortisol.
And most people think cortisol just gives you energy or makes you stressed.
Right. But its primary function is actually to eventually shut down the stress response. It binds to glucocorticoid receptors in the brain, creating a negative feedback loop that tells the system, okay, stop releasing adrenaline.
So in a healthy system, the cortisol spikes, hits the receptors, and turns the alarm off.
Yes. But in chronic lingering trauma, that negative feedback loop is broken. The HPA axis becomes completely dysregulated. Because the brain is hypersensitive to glucocorticoids, it aggressively suppresses cortisol production to compensate.
So the system is essentially burnt out.
Exactly. Yeah. And without sufficient baseline cortisol to properly apply the brakes, the sympathetic nervous system runs unchecked. It's a biological paradox where a lack of the primary stress hormone is what leaves the body in a state of constant, exhausting stress.
And Yehuda's work pushes that hormonal research even further, straight into epigenetics.
Her studies on Holocaust survivors are groundbreaking here.
Right. Her teams analyzed the blood markers of the children of Holocaust survivors, individuals who had not experienced the trauma of the camps themselves.
And they found specific epigenetic alterations related to how those glucocorticoid receptors function in the children.
So it's not changing the DNA itself, right?
No, the genetic code remains the same.
It's like handing down a highlighted instruction manual to your kids.
That's a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The biological text is identical, but the parents' profound trauma highlighted specific passages regarding threat detection.
It chemically altered how their children's genes were expressed.
Yes, it calibrated their baseline stress responses before they were even born. The environmental trauma of one generation chemically modifies the gene expression of the next.
That is staggering.
It forces the scientific community to view extreme trauma not just as an individual injury, but as a biological echo that can resonate across multiple generations.
So what does this all mean for you? Why does this deep dive matter outside a clinical setting?
Because this knowledge shapes the real world in profound ways. It shapes disability law, for one.
Right, making it highly contested.
Yes, the Veterans Affairs system constantly battles the complexities of adjudicating invisible injuries. They have to balance the risk of underdiagnosis against the challenges of verifying historical trauma.
And it reshapes the criminal justice system, too.
Absolutely. It informs judges and juries on why a survivor of domestic violence might have fragmented, nonlinear memories when testifying on the stand. It proves that inconsistent memory is a hallmark of trauma, not necessarily of deceit.
Which is such a vital distinction. And we've seen this urgency recently with frontline medical workers post-COVID-19 experiencing severe autonomic nervous system dysregulation.
Right, after prolonged exposure to mass casualty conditions.
Yeah.
But honestly, the most profound shift here is one of empathy.
Yeah.
Grasping the mechanics of the HPA axis and hippocampal fragmentation, it completely removes the moral judgment from the equation. We are looking at a brain attempting to survive an environment that exceeded its evolutionary capacity.
It's a biological threat detection issue, not a moral failing. And understanding that completely changes how we as friends, family, and employers can offer informed support instead of blame. You stop looking for a lack of willpower and start recognizing an overloaded nervous system.
Precisely. And that biological reality leads us to one last really provocative thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Well, if trauma can physically alter our biology, and potentially even influence the gene expression we pass down to our children. But resilience is statistically our most common and natural human response. How might we redesign our communities, our schools, and our workplaces to actively foster that natural resilience from day one? Instead of just waiting to treat the disorder after the fact, how do we build a society that supports the biology of recovery?
That is definitely something to think about.